on truth, but I couldn't have turned up late because in fact,
In the kaleidoscope of the 1970s glam rock explosion, few voices burned as brightly or as vulnerably as Brian Connolly's. At the height of Sweet's fame, his voice was instantly recognizable, sharp yet warm, theatrical but grounded, capable of cutting through walls of distortion while still sounding human and exposed. When the opening chant of Ballroom Blitz erupted from radios, it wasn't just a hit song, it was a declaration. And Brian Connolly stood at the center of that declaration, not just as a frontman, but as the emotional core of the band. On stage, wrapped in glitter, platform boots, and stage lights so intense they erased the crowd into darkness, Brian looked invincible. But behind the spectacle was a man carrying fractures that fame could never repair. Brian Connolly's story did not begin with applause or certainty. He was born in 1945 in Hamilton, South Lanarkshire, Scotland, into circumstances marked by absence and unanswered questions. His mother, Frances Connolly, was young, alone, and struggling. Shortly after his birth, she left him at a hospital in Glasgow, unable to raise him herself. The identity of his biological father was never recorded, leaving a blank space that would follow Brian throughout his life like a shadow he could never quite outrun. At the age of 2, Brian was fostered by Jim and Helen McManus, a working-class couple in Blantyre who offered him stability, affection, and something he had never known: belonging. They raised him as their own son, and for many years Brian believed that was exactly who he was. He grew up as Brian McManus, a lively, energetic boy who loved football, mechanics, and the simple rhythms of ordinary life. Music was present, but it was not yet destiny. At that stage, he dreamed of becoming an engineer, someone who built things that worked, things that made sense. Everything changed when he turned 18. That was the moment he learned the truth about his adoption. The revelation struck at the exact point when he was trying to define himself as an adult. Overnight, the ground beneath his identity shifted. The name he had lived under, the story he believed, even his sense of where he came from suddenly felt borrowed. In response, Brian made a decision that was both symbolic and deeply personal. He reclaimed his birth name, Connolly, as a way of reconnecting with the mother he never truly knew and the identity that had been hidden from him. It was not just a change of name, it was the first of many reinventions driven by a lifelong search for self. As he moved into his 20s, music began to take hold in a way that engineering never had. Brian possessed a rare combination of traits that demanded attention. He was good-looking, charismatic, and vocally gifted, with a natural sense of drama that made even small performances feel larger than life. He joined several local bands before becoming part of Wainwright's Gentlemen, a London-based group that performed regularly around Hayes, Harrow, and Wembley during the mid-1960s. The band was fluid, with members coming and going, but it provided Brian with something essential: a proving ground. Among the musicians who passed through that group was Ian Gillan, who would later achieve global fame with Deep Purple. When Gillan left, Brian stepped into the role of lead singer, and something clicked. On stage, he was no longer searching for who he was, he became it. His voice carried authority, his movements commanded space, and audiences responded immediately. It was during this period that Brian formed a crucial creative bond with drummer Mick Tucker. Their connection went beyond friendship. They shared ambition, instinct, and a hunger to build something of their own. In late 1967, Brian and Mick made a decisive move. They left Wainwright's Gentlemen with a clear goal: to create a band that would not blend in, but stand apart. In early 1968, they formed a new group alongside bassist Steve Priest and guitarist Frank Torpey. Initially called the Sweet Shop, the band played their first live show at the Pavilion in Hemel Hempstead. The audience was small, but the reaction was not. There was energy, attitude, and a sense that something was forming. Soon, the name was shortened to Sweet, a deceptively simple word that would soon become synonymous with glam rock excess. The early years were frustrating. Singles like Slow Motion and Lollipop Man failed to make an impact. Frank Torpey eventually left, and doubt crept in. But Brian and Mick refused to let the band dissolve. Their persistence paid off when they crossed paths with songwriting duo Nicky Chinn and Mike Chapman. Chinn and Chapman understood the charts, the hooks, and the mechanics of a hit. Sweet had the sound, the look, and crucially, Brian Connolly's voice to bring those songs to life. Their first major collaboration, Funny Funny in 1971, broke through and introduced Sweet to a wider audience. With guitarist Andy Scott joining the lineup, the classic version of Sweet was complete. What followed was a run of success that transformed them into one of the defining bands of the era. Coco, Little Willie, and Wigwam Bam dominated the charts. In 1973, Blockbuster reached #1 in the UK and stayed there for 5 weeks. Sweet were everywhere: television, magazines, stages across Europe. Their image became inseparable from the glam movement. Glitter, A-line, outrageous costumes, and unapologetic theatricality. Yet, behind the success, tension was growing. Sweet were often dismissed as a manufactured pop act, a label that frustrated the band deeply. They saw themselves as rock musicians, not just hitmakers. Brian, in particular, felt the strain. He was the voice fans recognized, the face at the center of the storm, and the pressure weighed heavily. In response, the band began writing their own material, pushing towards a heavier, darker sound. This shift culminated in the 1974 album Sweet Fanny Adams, a hard rock statement that proved they were more than their glitter image. That same year, everything changed. Outside a club in Staines, Brian was violently attacked. The assault caused severe damage to his throat and vocal cords. Though the band publicly described it as a throat infection, the truth was far devastating. Brian's voice, the instrument that had carried Sweet to the top, was permanently altered. He could still sing, but the ease, range, and power were diminished. The loss was psychological as much as physical. For a man whose identity was so closely tied to his voice, it was a wound that never healed. As the years passed, Brian's confidence eroded. Alcohol became a coping mechanism. Performances grew inconsistent. In 1978, during a concert in Birmingham, Alabama, Brian collapsed on stage, visibly intoxicated in front of record executives. It was a breaking point. Later that year, during the recording of Cut Above the Rest, it became clear that his health and voice could no longer sustain the demands of the band. On November 2, 1978, Brian Connolly left Sweet. Officially, it was to pursue a solo career. In reality, it was an ending shaped by loss, exhaustion, and quiet heartbreak. What followed was a lonely road. Brian attempted to rebuild with solo releases and later with a reformed version of the band known as the New Sweet. In Europe, particularly Germany, fans still embraced him, but financially and physically he struggled. Tax debts forced him to sell his home. Relationships collapsed. His health continued to decline. Still, he performed. Music remained his refuge, even as it demanded what little strength he had left. In the mid-1990s, Brian made one final attempt at renewal. He released the album Let's Go and found happiness again with his partner Gene. Together, they had a son, Brian Jr. Perhaps most importantly, Gene helped him reconnect with his biological family in Canada, offering him a sense of closure he had searched for his entire life. For a brief moment, peace seemed possible, but time was unforgiving. Years of alcohol abuse and heart problems left Brian partially paralyzed. In 1996, a Channel 4 documentary showed a fragile yet defiant man, visibly weakened but still smiling, still performing, still holding on to the stage that had once given him everything. His final concert took place in December of that year. 2 months later, on February 9, 1997, Brian Connolly died from liver and kidney failure compounded by heart attacks. He was 51 years old. Today, Brian Connolly's legacy lives on in the songs that defined glam rock's golden age: Ballroom Blitz, Fox on the Run, Hellraiser. They remain powerful, joyful, and unmistakably his. Behind the glitter was a man who searched for identity, fought through pain, and gave his voice until there was nothing left to give. His story is a reminder that beneath